The desert was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your horse uneasy. He wasn't supposed to stop. Not in Apache territory. Not alone. Not after what folks back in town had warned him about. Then he saw the boy, barefoot, covered in dust, fighting to keep a trembling horse on its feet. Something in that moment didn't look like danger. It looked like desperation. The stranger had a choice: ride on and pretend he never saw them, or risk stepping into a world he didn't understand, a world that might never forgive him for crossing its invisible line. He chose to stop. What happened next wasn't what he expected. Not the boy's reaction. Not the tribe's arrival. And definitely not the way they responded when they learned what he had done. Because sometimes in the Wild West, the greatest battles weren't fought with guns. They were fought with trust. And that day, trust would change everything. If you love real Western legends, untold frontier moments, and powerful horseback stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Horseback Legends Western Stories. Share this story with someone who still believes the Wild West wasn't just about shootouts, but about heart. Now let's ride into this story. The desert didn't warn you when you were about to make a mistake. It just watched. The sun hung high over the dry Arizona territory, baking the earth into cracked clay and pale dust. A lone rider moved across the open land, his silhouette cutting through heat waves that shimmered like ghosts rising from the ground. His name was Daniel Mercer, a cattle hand by trade, a quiet man by nature, not the kind looking for trouble. But trouble didn't always ask permission. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, slowed without command. Ears twitching, head lifting slightly, Daniel noticed. That was the thing about seasoned riders. They trusted their horses before they trusted their own instincts. "What is it, boy?" he muttered under his breath. The wind had died. No birds overhead. No distant coyote calls. Just silence. And if you knew the frontier, you knew silence wasn't always peace. Back in town, a small trading post 2 days' ride behind him, men had talked, quietly, carefully. "Apache, country starts past the red cliffs. Don't cross that dry riverbed unless you're ready to. Answer for it. They don't forget trespassers." Daniel hadn't planned on crossing any invisible lines. He was just cutting across land to shorten his route north. It wasn't marked. No fences, no signs, but everyone knew. You don't cross certain land without consequence. Rusty shifted again. That's when Daniel saw him. At first, it looked like a small shape near the bend of a dried wash. Maybe a bundle of cloth caught in brush. Then it moved. A boy, thin, barefoot, maybe 12 or 13. He was kneeling beside a horse, a tall, strong-built Mustang with a deep chestnut coat now darkened with sweat. One of its front legs trembled. Its head hung low. Daniel didn't move. He stayed still in the saddle, watching. The boy was speaking softly in a language Daniel didn't understand. His hands were steady, but his face carried something heavy. Fear. The horse tried to step. It stumbled. Daniel's jaw tightened. A lame horse out here wasn't just inconvenience. It was survival slipping through your fingers. The boy pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, whispered again. And that's when Daniel saw it. The leg. There was swelling near the lower joint, possibly a twisted tendon. Maybe worse. Daniel felt the old tug in his chest, the one he got whenever an animal suffered. He'd grown up around horses, worked ranches since he could walk. He knew injuries. He knew when something might still be saved. And he knew when it couldn't. The smart choice? Turn around. No one would know he saw anything. No one would blame him for staying clear of Apache territory. Because the boy, there was no mistaking it now, was Apache. The cut of his hair, the handmade leather strap around his wrist, the small beaded detail on his shirt. Daniel swallowed. If he rode down there uninvited, it could mean trouble. Real trouble. But if he rode away, he'd carry that image with him. A boy alone. A horse failing. The desert watching. What would you have done? Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he nudged Rusty forward. Not fast, not threatening. Just enough to be seen. The boy noticed immediately. He rose to his feet in one swift motion, placing himself between the stranger and the injured horse. There was no panic in his eyes, only warning. Daniel raised both hands slightly, keeping the reins loose. I'm not here to harm, he called out gently. The boy didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't speak. His posture said enough. This land is not yours. Daniel dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dirt with a soft crunch. He stayed beside Rusty, not advancing yet. Up close, the situation looked worse. The Mustang's leg was swelling fast. Sweat foamed along its neck. Nostrils flared hard. The boy's hands were clenched at his sides. Daniel pointed gently toward the leg. He stepped wrong? Silence? The boy's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the horse's labored breathing. Then, quietly, the boy nodded once. Daniel stepped closer, slowly, giving the boy time to object. He crouched near the injured leg, careful not to make sudden movements. The Mustang flinched, but didn't kick. That told him something. Strong animal. Brave. He reached out and pressed lightly around the swelling. The horse twitched, but not violently. Not broken, Daniel muttered mostly to himself. That's good. The boy's eyes sharpened slightly, as if catching the tone if not the words. Daniel glanced up. If we cool it, wrap it tight, let him rest. He might walk again. The boy didn't understand the language, but he understood hope. You could see it flicker, just slightly. Daniel stood and walked back to Rusty. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled cloth, a small tin of salve, and a canteen. When he turned back, the boy had shifted his stance, still guarded, but no longer blocking him entirely. Permission? Maybe. Daniel poured water slowly over the swollen leg. The Mustang shuddered, but stayed upright. The boy dropped to his knees beside him, placing both hands against the horse's neck, murmuring steady words. They worked without speaking. Two strangers. One goal. Daniel applied the salve carefully, then wrapped the cloth snug, but not tight enough to cut circulation. He'd done this dozens of times back on ranches. Out here, though, the stakes felt different. Higher. The wind picked up slightly, brushing sand across their boots. Daniel had just finished tying the last knot when Rusty suddenly lifted his head sharply, ears pinned forward. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze, and his blood ran cold. Shapes moving along the ridge above them. Not one, several. Riders, silent, watching. The boy didn't turn. He already knew. Daniel stood slowly. Apache warriors lined the horizon, mounted and still as statues. He counted at least 6, maybe more behind them. No shouting, no weapons drawn, just presence. And suddenly, Daniel understood something important. He hadn't just crossed a line in the sand. He had stepped into the middle of a test. The boy rose to his feet. The Mustang stood trembling but upright beside him. The warriors began descending the ridge, slow, controlled, measured. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears. Had he just made the worst mistake of his life? Or the most important one? The desert no longer felt silent. It felt like it was holding its breath. And in the space between heartbeats, Daniel realized something. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about intention. And in the Wild West, intentions were everything. The riders did not rush Dot. They didn't need to Dot power. Daniel realized, did not always move fast. Sometimes it moved slow, so you could feel every second of it. 6 Apache warriors circled down from the ridge, their horses sure-footed on the rocky slope. Dust rose around them in quiet spirals. No one spoke. No weapon was raised. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than gunfire. Daniel kept his hands visible at his sides. He didn't reach for Rusty's reins, didn't step backward, didn't step forward. He simply stood. The boy remained beside the injured Mustang, one hand resting against its neck. His chin was lifted now, not in fear, but in belonging. This was his ground. Daniel was the stranger. The riders formed a loose half-circle around them. Their faces were calm, focused, reading him. One older man guided his horse a few steps closer than the others. His hair was streaked with gray, tied neatly back. His posture was straight, balanced, like someone who had long enough to see too much, yet still stood firm. A leader. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the wrapped leg of the Mustang, then to Daniel. Not anger. Assessment. Daniel swallowed once and forced himself to breathe steady. He pointed gently to the horse's leg again. "He stepped wrong," he said quietly, though he knew the words wouldn't carry meaning. "I helped." The boy stepped forward then, speaking rapidly in Apache. His voice was strong now, animated. He gestured toward Daniel, toward the salve, toward the cloth wrapping. The older man listened without interrupting. When the boy finished, the wind swept between them again. The leader slid from his horse in one smooth motion, boots touching the ground without sound. He approached the Mustang first, knelt, carefully inspected the leg. His fingers traced the wrapping Daniel had tied. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. This was the moment? Had he wrapped it wrong? Too tight? Too loose? Had he dishonored something he didn't understand? The older man pressed lightly near the swelling. The horse shifted, but did not collapse. Then something unexpected happened. The leader nodded. Just once, small, controlled, but unmistakable. A murmur passed through the other riders, low, almost like wind through dry grass. The boy looked up at Daniel, and for the first time, there was no warning in his eyes, only relief. The older man stood and turned toward Daniel. He stepped close enough that Daniel could see faint lines carved by years of sun and responsibility. They locked eyes. Daniel had met hardened ranch bosses, outlaws, lawmen. This was different. This man carried weight without needing to prove it. He spoke a few measured words. Daniel didn't understand them, but the tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't hostile. It sounded deliberate. Then the boy stepped beside the leader and translated in broken English. He says, "You touch horse with care." Daniel blinked once. The boy hesitated, searching for the right words. This horse. Not just horse. He placed his hand over his own chest. Brother. Daniel looked at the Mustang differently. He'd seen horses as partners, as workers, as valuable. But brother, that was something else. The boy continued carefully. My father ride this horse. Before me, before him. My grandfather. Daniel's breath slowed. This wasn't livestock. This was bloodline. In many Apache tribes, horses weren't just animals. They were symbols of strength, survival, spirit. A horse passed down through generations carried more than saddle marks. It carried memory. And now it stood trembling, one wrong step away from ending that line. Daniel glanced at the swelling again. It'll need rest, he said quietly, even if they couldn't understand. No riding for a while. The boy watched his mouth carefully, catching pieces of tone if not vocabulary. The leader spoke again, softer this time. The boy translated. He asks, "Why you stop?" Daniel paused. That question felt heavier than any weapon. Why did he stop? Because he liked horses? Because he couldn't ride away? Because something inside him refused to ignore it? He chose the simplest truth. I saw he needed help. The boy listened, then translated slowly. The leader studied Daniel for a long moment. The other riders remained still, like carved figures against the desert. Then the boy added something Daniel hadn't said. He says, "Many white men ride away." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. That one landed, because it wasn't accusation. It was fact. The wind shifted again, rushing the Mustang's mane. The horse attempted a careful step. It winced, but stayed upright. The leader moved beside it, placing one steady hand against its shoulder. His touch was firm, grounded. He spoke quietly to the horse. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Respect, not ownership. Respect. You could learn a lot about a man by how he treated his animals. The leader looked back at Daniel once more. Then he did something that surprised him. He extended his hand. Not in the American handshake style, but palm open. Daniel hesitated only a heartbeat before placing his own hand forward. Their palms met, firm, steady, a bridge. The riders shifted slightly, not tense now, but observant. The boy stepped closer to Daniel. "You cross line," he said carefully. "But you cross with good heart." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The tension didn't vanish completely, but it changed. The air no longer felt like it was waiting for violence. It felt like it was measuring something else. Character. The leader spoke again. Longer this time. The boy listened intently, then turned to Daniel. He says, "You stay." Daniel blinked. "Stay?" The boy nodded. "Stay. See if horse strong tomorrow." Daniel glanced toward the horizon instinctively. He had planned to keep riding north. Supplies were limited. Time mattered. But then he looked at the Mustang. At the careful way, the boy rested his forehead against its neck. At the circle of riders who could have chosen force, but hadn't. And he realized something. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about witness. If he left now, he would never know whether the horse healed. Never know whether trust could grow further. The desert had given him a choice once already. Ride away, or stay. Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll stay." The boy smiled, small but genuine. The leader gave one final nod. The circle of riders opened slightly, not as a warning, as an invitation. And as the sun began lowering toward the red cliffs, Daniel Mercer understood something that would stay with him the rest of his life. Sometimes the most valuable thing in the Wild West wasn't gold. It wasn't land. It wasn't pride. It was the moment when two worlds decided not to fear each other. But the night ahead would test that fragile understanding. Because trust, like a wounded horse, needed more than good intentions to survive. The sun dipped low, dragging long shadows across the desert floor. Daniel had expected tension. He hadn't expected ceremony. It was. Structure. Order. The Apache camp came into view beyond a shallow rise. Not chaotic, not scattered, but arranged with purpose. Woven lodges stood firm against the wind. Small cooking fires burned steady. Children moved between them like quick flashes of life. Laughter carried lightly on the air. And yet, when Daniel entered behind the riders, the laughter stopped. Not dramatically, not loudly, just gradually. Heads turned, eyes followed. Women paused mid-task. Older men straightened from where they sat. Daniel felt the weight of being seen. He had walked into towns before, as a stranger, sure. But this was different. Here, he was not just unknown. He was history. The boy led the Mustang carefully toward a shaded space near one of the lodges. Two older women approached immediately, examining the leg without a word. Their movements were efficient, practiced. Daniel stepped back instinctively, allowing space. The leader, the same older man from the ridge, dismounted and gestured subtly for Daniel to follow him toward the central fire. Daniel's boots pressed into softer earth now, the scent of smoke and sage drifting through the air. No one spoke to him, but no one reached for a weapon either. You could feel the quiet question hanging over the camp. Why is he here? The leader stopped near the fire pit and motioned for Daniel to sit. Daniel lowered himself slowly onto a flat stone. He kept his posture respectful, hands resting loosely on his knees. The leader remained standing for a moment, scanning the camp. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Others gathered gradually, forming a loose circle, just as the riders had earlier. Not threatening, witnessing. The boy stepped forward again, standing slightly behind the leader. "He tells them what you did," the boy said softly to Daniel. Daniel nodded once. The leader spoke steadily, gesturing toward the injured Mustang, toward Daniel, toward the ridge where they had first seen him. There was no anger in his tone. There was gravity. An older woman in the circle asked something sharply. The boy listened, then translated. "She says, why trust him?" Daniel couldn't blame her. Trust had not always been rewarded kindly on either side of this land. The leader responded calmly, firm. The boy's eyes moved back to Daniel. "He says he watched your hands." Daniel frowned slightly. "My hands?" The boy nodded. "He says, a man's hands tell truth." Daniel looked down at them unconsciously. Rough, scarred, weathered by rope, burns, and rains. Not soft hands, working hands. He glanced toward the Mustang again, where the women were now carefully applying a fresh herbal paste around the swelling. The boy had explained earlier that the horse was named Taza, meaning something like sunlight in their language. Daniel liked that. Taza. It fit the animal. A younger warrior stepped forward now, his expression sharper than the others. He spoke directly to the leader, his tone edged with something Daniel recognized immediately. Doubt. The boy translated again, carefully. "He says, maybe you help today. Maybe tomorrow you bring soldiers." That one struck harder. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had no soldiers, no connection to them, but words weren't enough here. The leader raised his hand slightly, silencing the younger warrior. Then he did something unexpected. He turned to Daniel and gestured toward Taza. "Come," the boy translated. Daniel stood slowly and walked with the leader toward the horse. The Mustang was calmer now, though still favoring its leg. The women stepped aside as Daniel approached. The leader pointed at the wrapping. Daniel understood. He knelt again, carefully untied the cloth. The swelling had not worsened. That was good. He gently pressed around the joint again, testing. The Mustang flinched, but held steady. Daniel spoke softly to the animal without thinking. "Easy now. You're stronger than this." The horse's ears flicked toward his voice. The leader watched closely. Every movement, every touch. Daniel rewrapped the leg, slower this time, ensuring each fold was precise. When he finished, he didn't stand immediately. Instead, he rested his palm against Taza's neck, just like the boy had done earlier. No performance, no show, just quiet reassurance. The leader stepped forward, placed his own hand over Daniel's for a brief second, not gripping, not restraining, just overlapping. Then he addressed the circle again. His voice was different now, lower, certain. The boy translated. "He says, a man who harms does not move like that." Silence followed. The younger warrior didn't argue again. The fire crackled softly. The sky shifted from orange to deep violet. Stars began to emerge one by one. Daniel realized something slowly settling into place. This wasn't a trial by weapons. It was a trial by patience, by observation, by restraint. The leader turned back to Daniel once more. "You eat with us," the boy said carefully. It wasn't a question. It was acceptance, partial, cautious, but real. Food was brought. Simple. Roasted meat, flatbread, something warm with herbs. Daniel accepted it with a quiet nod. He ate slowly, aware that every bite was being noticed, not judged harshly, just observed. You could feel the shift now. small but meaningful. The younger children began whispering again. One even stepped closer, staring openly at Daniel's boots, before being gently guided back by his mother. The night deepened. The desert cooled. And for the first time since he crossed that invisible line, Daniel's pulse wasn't pounding in his ears. He sat by the fire, listening to a language he didn't understand, yet feeling strangely included in its rhythm. The boy settled beside him eventually. "Taza strong," he said quietly. Daniel looked toward the horse resting in the shadows. "He is," Daniel replied. The boy studied him for a moment. Then he asked something that caught Daniel off guard. "You afraid?" Daniel considered lying. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Yeah, I was." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "I was too." They both looked at the fire. And somewhere in that shared honesty, something solidified. The leader watched them from across the flames, eyes thoughtful. This night wasn't over. Trust had begun, but it was still fragile. And tomorrow would decide whether this stranger remained a guest or became something far more unexpected. Morning came quietly, no trumpet of sunlight, no dramatic shift, just a slow warming of the air and a pale glow stretching across the horizon. Daniel had barely slept, not because he feared an attack. That fear had softened overnight, but because he understood something now. He wasn't here by accident, and he wasn't being judged for what he had done. He was being measured for who he was. When he stepped out from where he had rested near the outer edge of camp, he saw movement already underway. Fires relit, water carried, horses checked. Life did not pause for uncertainty. Taza stood beneath the same shaded covering. The boy, whose name Daniel had learned was Nanton, was already beside him. Daniel walked over slowly. "How's he looking?" he asked softly. Nanton didn't understand all the words, but he caught the meaning. He smiled slightly. "Better." Daniel crouched beside the horse again. Carefully, gently. He removed the cloth wrapping once more. The swelling had gone down just a fraction. Not healed, but improving. That mattered. He ran his hand along the tendon carefully. Taza shifted weight, but did not buckle. Strong animal. Strong spirit. "You'll walk again," Daniel murmured. Behind him, he felt presence before he heard it. The leader had approached. Daniel didn't turn immediately. He finished adjusting the wrap first, taking his time. No rush, no performance. When he finally stood, the leader spoke. Longer this time, measured. Nanton listened carefully, then turned to Daniel. "He says, 'Today we see.'" "See what?" Daniel asked. Nanton hesitated. If heart sane when sun high, Daniel understood. It was easy to act kind when watched closely. Different when comfort settled in. Different when pride crept back. The younger warrior from the night before stepped forward again. His expression wasn't hostile now, just firm. He held out something. A rope. Daniel glanced down at it, confused. Nanton translated. "He says, 'Help move horses to water.'" Daniel looked toward the edge of camp, where several horses stood loosely gathered, not tied tightly, not confined harshly, trusted. He nodded once and accepted the rope. No dramatic declaration. Just action. They walked together, Daniel, the younger warrior, and two others, toward the herd. The younger warrior gave short commands in Apache. The horses responded calmly. Daniel watched closely. He didn't try to take control, didn't try to show off. Instead, he mirrored their movements. Calm body, steady pace, no sudden gestures. One of the horses, a gray mare, hesitated near a rocky slope. Daniel stepped slightly to her side, angling gently without touching her. Pressure without force. She moved forward. The younger warrior noticed, said nothing, but noticed. They guided the herd toward a narrow watering spot between two stone formations. The ground there was uneven, tricky footing. One misstep could mean injury. Daniel's eyes scanned constantly, watching hooves, watching spacing. A young colt broke formation suddenly, startled by a lizard darting from the rocks. Without thinking, Daniel shifted quickly, not chasing, not shouting, but cutting off the colt's path smoothly, redirecting him back toward the group. He didn't grab the rope hard, didn't yank, just steady redirection. The younger warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in recognition. They reached the water safely. The horses drank. No chaos, no strain. The work wasn't flashy, but it was careful. And careful meant respect. When they returned to camp, the leader stood waiting. Nanton translated again. He says, "You listen." Daniel tilted his head slightly. To who? Nanton smiled faintly. To horses. Daniel couldn't help but let out a quiet breath of laughter. That's the only way to work with them. The leader's gaze softened just slightly. Then something shifted. From beyond the outer edge of camp, a distant rumble echoed. Not thunder. Hooves. Fast. Daniel turned instinctively. 3 riders approached from the southern ridge. Not Apache. Different saddles. Different posture. White men. And they were riding hard. The camp tightened immediately. Not panic. Preparation. The younger warrior moved beside Daniel instinctively, not guarding him, not trusting him either, just positioning. The riders slowed only when they saw the camp in full view. Daniel's stomach tightened. He recognized one of them, a ranch hand from the trading post. They hadn't seen him enter Apache land yesterday, but they must have tracked his trail. One of the riders cupped his hands and shouted, "Daniel, what in God's name are you doing in there?" The words carried sharp across the open air. Several Apache warriors stiffened slightly. Daniel felt every eye in the camp shift toward him. This was the test. Not rope work, not horse care. This, the ranch hand shouted again. "You all right? They holding you?" Daniel stepped forward slowly. He raised one hand, not toward the riders, toward the Apache leader. A subtle signal. He wasn't asking permission. He was offering clarity. Then he turned toward the approaching men. "I'm fine," he called back, his voice steady. "Turn around." The riders looked confused. One scoffed loudly. "You out of your mind? We're coming in." Daniel's voice sharpened. "No, you're not." Silence hit like a dropped stone. Even the wind paused. Nearby, the Apache leader spoke quietly with several elders. Their conversation was slow, thoughtful, a kind that carried weight even without raised voices. Not confrontational, purposeful. The entire camp seemed to pause. Even the younger children sensed something important was happening. Nanton rose to his feet quickly. The leader stopped a few steps away from Daniel. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind brushed softly across the sand between them. Then the leader reached out and placed a hand against Taz's shoulder. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word. Nanton listened with full attention, then turned to Daniel. He says, "You came as stranger." Daniel remained silent. The leader continued speaking. Nanton translated again. "You crossed land that many fear." Daniel gave a small nod. "That's true." The leader's voice remained calm, steady like the desert itself. He says, "Many men carry weapons when they are afraid." The boy paused before translating the next part. "But you carried kindness." The words hung in the air for a moment. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, because kindness wasn't something he had ever thought of as brave. It was just the right thing to do. The leader stepped closer now, close enough that Daniel could see the reflection of the fire pit behind him in the elder's eyes. He says, "Horses know a man's heart." Nanton placed his hand gently on Taz's neck again. "This horse did not fear you." Daniel glanced at the Mustang. Taz stood calm beside him. That alone seemed to mean something here. The leader reached down slowly and untied the cloth wrapping from the horse's leg. Daniel watched carefully. The swelling had gone down further, not gone, but improving. The leader looked back at Daniel. He says, "You helped save a life that carries our history." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more respect than words. The leader lifted his hand slightly. One of the warriors behind him stepped forward holding something. A rope, not an ordinary rope. A braided horse lead, carefully crafted with leather strips and small beadwork woven along its length. Daniel's eyes moved across the design. It wasn't decorative for show. It was made for use. Strong, beautiful. In a quiet way, the leader took the rope and held it out. Nanton smiled as he translated. He says, "When a man shows respect to our horse." The boy paused, choosing the words carefully. "We show respect to the man." Daniel blinked once. "You want me to take it?" Nanton nodded. "Yes." Daniel hesitated for a moment. In the West, gifts could carry meaning far beyond the object itself. This wasn't payment. It wasn't charity. It was something deeper. Trust. He accepted the braided lead rope slowly. The leather felt strong in his hands. Real. The leader nodded once, satisfied. Then he spoke again. Nanton's smile widened slightly as he translated. He says, "You are welcome to ride this land again." Daniel looked up, surprised. Apache territory wasn't open to just anyone. That kind of invitation meant something. Something rare. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. The leader studied him for another moment. Then he added something else. Nanton hesitated before translating this part. He says, "Next time you come." The boy chuckled softly. "Come sooner." For the first time since arriving, laughter rippled gently through the camp. Not loud, but warm. Daniel felt the tension inside his chest finally release. Even the younger warrior who had doubted him earlier stepped forward slightly. He placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Not apology. Acknowledgement, the kind earned through action. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Daniel prepared Rusty for the ride back. He checked the saddle, tightened the cinch, and tied the braided rope carefully to the saddle horn. Nanton walked beside him the whole time. "You come back?" the boy asked. Daniel glanced toward Taza, who now stood more confidently on all four legs. "Yeah," Daniel said with a faint smile. "I think I will." Morning came quietly. No trumpet of sunlight, no dramatic shift. Just a slow warming of the air and a pale glow stretching across the horizon. Daniel had barely slept. Not because he feared an attack. That fear had softened overnight, but because he understood something now. He wasn't here by accident, and he wasn't being judged for what he had done. He was being measured for who he was. When he stepped out from where he had rested near the outer edge of camp, he saw movement already underway. Fires were lit, water carried, horses checked. Life did not pause for uncertainty. Taza stood beneath the same shaded covering. The boy, whose name Daniel had learned was Nanton, was already beside him. Daniel walked over slowly. "How's he looking?" he asked softly. Nanton didn't understand all the words, but he caught the meaning. He smiled slightly. "Better." Daniel crouched beside the horse again. Carefully, gently, he removed the cloth wrapping once more. The swelling had gone down just a fraction. Not healed, but improving. That mattered. He ran his hand along the tendon carefully. Taza shifted weight, but did not buckle. Strong animal, strong spirit. "You'll walk again," Daniel murmured. Behind him, he felt presence before he heard it. The leader had approached. Daniel didn't turn immediately. He finished adjusting the wrap first, taking his time. No rush, no performance. When he finally stood, the leader spoke. Longer this time. Measured. Nanton listened carefully, then turned to Daniel. He says, "Today we see." "See what?" Daniel asked. Nanton hesitated. If heart same when sun high, Daniel understood. It was easy to act kind when watched closely. Different when comfort settled in. Different when pride crept back. The younger warrior from the night before stepped forward again. His expression wasn't hostile now, just firm. He held out something. A rope. Daniel glanced down at it, confused. Nanton translated. "He says, help move horses to water." Daniel looked toward the edge of camp, where several horses stood loosely gathered, not tied tightly, not confined harshly, trusted. He nodded once and accepted the rope. No dramatic declaration, just action. They walked together, Daniel, the younger warrior, and two others, toward the herd. The younger warrior gave short commands in Apache. The horses responded calmly. Daniel watched closely. He didn't try to take control, didn't try to show off. Instead, he mirrored their movements. Calm body, steady pace, no sudden gestures. One of the horses, a gray mare, hesitated near a rocky slope. Daniel stepped slightly to her side, angling gently without touching her, pressure without force. She moved forward. The younger warrior noticed, said nothing, but noticed. They guided the herd toward a narrow watering spot between two stone formations. The ground there was uneven, tricky footing. One misstep could mean injury. Daniel's eyes scanned constantly, watching hooves, watching spacing. A young colt broke formation suddenly, startled by a lizard darting from the rocks. Without thinking, Daniel shifted quickly, not chasing, not shouting, but cutting off the colt's path smoothly, redirecting him back toward the group. He didn't grab the rope hard, didn't yank, just steady redirection. The younger warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in recognition. They reached the water safely. The horses drank. No chaos, no strain. The work wasn't flashy, but it was careful, and careful meant respect. When they returned to camp, the leader stood waiting. Nanton translated again. He says, "You listen." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "To who?" Nanton smiled faintly. "To horses." Daniel couldn't help but let out a quiet breath of laughter. That's the only way to work with them. The leader's gaze softened just slightly. Then something shifted. From beyond the outer edge of camp, a distant rumble echoed. Not thunder. Hooves. Fast. Daniel turned instinctively. 3 riders approached from the southern ridge, not Apache. Different saddles. Different posture. White men. And they were riding hard. The camp tightened immediately. Not panic. Preparation. The younger warrior moved beside Daniel instinctively, not guarding him, not trusting him either. Just positioning. The riders slowed only when they saw the camp in full view. Daniel's stomach tightened. He recognized one of them. A ranch hand from the trading post. They hadn't seen him enter Apache land yesterday, but they must have tracked his trail. One of the riders cupped his hands and shouted, "Daniel, what in God's name are you doing in there?" The words carried sharp across the open air. Several Apache warriors stiffened slightly. Daniel felt every eye in the camp shift toward him. This was the test. Not rope work. Not horse care. This, the ranch hand shouted again. "You all right? They holding you?" Daniel stepped forward slowly. He raised one hand, not toward the riders, toward the Apache leader. A subtle signal. He wasn't asking permission. He was offering clarity. Then he turned toward the approaching men. "I'm fine," he called back, his voice steady. "Turn around." The riders looked confused. One scoffed loudly. "You out of your mind? We're coming in." Daniel's voice sharpened. "No, you're not." Silence hit like a dropped stone. Even the wind paused. "You crossed that line," Daniel continued. "Louder now, and you won't like what follows." The ranch hand stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "You siding with them now?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'm standing where I need to." Behind him, he could feel the shift. Not relief. Not celebration. Recognition. The ranch hand cursed under his breath. He glanced at the armed Apache warriors lining the edge of camp, and back at Daniel. "You're making a mistake." Daniel shook his head once. "No, I almost did. Yesterday." The riders lingered a moment longer. Then slowly, they turned their horses and rode back the way they came. The rumble faded into distance. Silence returned. Daniel exhaled slowly. When he turned back toward the camp, the leader was watching him closely. So was the younger warrior. Nenton stepped beside him. "You send them away," he said softly. Daniel nodded. They didn't belong here. The leader walked forward, close enough to stand within arm's reach. He studied Daniel's face for a long, searching moment. Then he spoke. Nenton translated quietly. "He says, 'Now we see.'" And this time, there was no doubt in his voice. The test hadn't been about horses. It had been about loyalty when it counted. And Daniel had chosen, not sides, but respect. The desert sun climbed higher overhead. Taza lifted his head in the shade. And something in the air felt different now. Not fragile, not uncertain, solid, but the tribe's final response. That was still coming.